Gus buys a bull. One day I went to the sale yards to see how stock was selling, and who should I see up on the rails but old Gus Tomlins. "Come on, Mark," he shouted, "I'm going in for pedigree jerseys. You know a little bit about bulls. Let's have the benefit of your knowledge." I climbed up on the rail beside him and viewed the stuff below. Gus was on the waiver as to which of 2 bulls he would bid for. He wanted my opinion, but I wasn't having any. I helped him to buy a jibbing horse once, and although my part in the business was advising him not to buy, he had forgotten that and reproaches me about that horse every time he thinks of it. My idea about buying things is to use your own judgment and not go running round to all your friends trying to put the responsibility onto them. I told Gus that, and he said certainly it was his money and he intended to suit himself, but there was no need for me to stop like a deaf mute about it. I could express my opinion without hurting anybody. I remembered hearing a man say once that a fine tail was a good sign in Jersey stuff, so I pointed out the bull with the finest tail and said I fancied him. "Him," said Gus. "Where's your eyes, man? Look at this other fellow, better class of bull all round." I knew that's how it would be. I never know anything. I drew Gus's attention to the tail, but he had some facts about depth of neck, straightness of back and so on, and floored me completely. Gus was about the greatest man for collecting that sort of knowledge that I ever struck. It's a marvel to me he isn't a millionaire by now, the useful things he knows. He can discourse scientifically on any branch of farming you like to open out on, and he admits himself that the only thing that keeps him back is a lack of capital. If he only had a few thousands to work on, he'd show people how to make money. He finally bought the bull his own fancy declared the best, and after he'd made arrangements with the drover to get it out home that night, we went uptown and had a drink to celebrate the bargain. Gus said it was a good job he hadn't taken any notice of me. He would have been landed in the soup if he'd bought the thing I fancied. He said he had a bundle of old papers over at his place, and if I liked, he would lend them to me, and I could study the pictures and get an idea of type. All great breeds relied on type to sell their stock, and it would pay me to study it up a bit. Perhaps I might want to buy a pedigree bull myself someday, and he wouldn't always be about to help me. As a matter of fact, Gus said he had an idea he might sell out pretty shortly and go up Auckland way. He thought there was more scope for a good judge of stock up that way. In Gus's opinion, Taranaki was about played out. Every little farmer fancied himself a pedigree man, and real sound knowledge and judgment wasn't appreciated. I drew Gus's attention to the fact I'd bought a pedigree bull 2 years ago, and he said, "Hello, that," and went on about what a pity it was he hadn't been there at the time. "They'd never have landed you with that scarecrow if I'd been there, Mark." Up till then I'd always been rather proud of that bull of mine. To hear Gus talk like that hurt my feelings, and I had to tell him, at least my bull was quiet. The bull Gus had just purchased looked anything but quiet to me. Gus said, "Pooh, I'll put a ring in his nose tomorrow, and after he's been tied up a day or 2 and fed on hay, I'll have him like a sheep." He proceeded to make plans about ringing the bull. I was to come over after dinner and help him drive the bull across my stockyard, and we would ring him there. I had arranged to meet an uncle of mine that day, but Gus said that would be all right. He'd square Tom Wilson to go and meet the mail train, and my uncle could come up with Tom. My Uncle John is getting a bit old and fatty, and I like to humour the old chap if I can, so I thought it would be better if Gus put the job off for a day and let me meet the old man myself. To hear Gus growling and mumbling, anyone would have thought it was his uncle and that he didn't want him, but I was firm. If a man has relations coming to see him, the least he can do is make them welcome. Another thing, Uncle John has 3 or 4 farms down on the good land, Harawira way, and has often told me he thinks it's a pity I wasn't on land like his down there. He has at least at present, but that's no reason why I should go out of my way to wound the old chap's feelings. I went down to get Uncle myself. He had a bottle of whiskey in his coat pocket and another in his bag. I must say he's a game old sport for an old man. Gus and I sat up with him till 3 a.m, listening to his hair-raising yarns about the good old days. If we hadn't mopped up all the old chap's whiskey, he'd have never gone to bed. One thing about old Gus, he never fails a man. Any time Uncle John is due, I give Gus the wire and he ambles along to help me get rid of the whiskey. That's the one way I can handle the old boy at all. Dispose of his liquid refreshments, and he generally fills in one day getting over the journey, and then has important business calling him away. I always turn my bed over to Uncle John and doss on cow covers and a heap of hay, but he is too old to really appreciate the sacrifice. He just takes it for granted I always sleep in the corner on that heap of hay. I got up at 6 a.m. the morning after Uncle arrived, and we went out to get my cows in. I didn't hear Gus over the way, so I had to slip over and give him a call. Gus was fast asleep, and when I shook him and said, "Come on, Gus, you're half an hour late," he broke out with a dismal groan. I felt a bit seedy myself, somehow or other, but work had to be done. Gus told me that morning that if he had an uncle like my Uncle John, he'd buy a gun. I could see he must be feeling pretty low to talk about a man's relation like that. I got back from the factory about 9:30, and all the way home I was picturing the fire Uncle John would have lit and the nice cup of tea that would be all ready for me. I spotted the chimney when I was still half a mile off, but couldn't see any smoke. I whipped old Bloss up. A man never knows when the old chaps are going to turn it in, and it struck me Gus might have to wait another day to ring his bull after all. It was all right as it happened. Uncle John hadn't woke up, that was all. I left him in bed while I fried some steak and made the tea, and when I had breakfast fixed up on a clean plate, I took it in. I took a lot of trouble over that breakfast. I know Uncle John doesn't like black finger marks on the crockery or verdigris on the fork, and I polished everything up with the dishcloth for him, but it was labour wasted. He sat up in bed with a look of incredulous horror. Steak? Steak in the morning? Hang it! What did I think he was? A crocodile? I didn't think anything of the sort, but I could see it was no use arguing, so I took the feed out again and ate it myself. Then the old boy climbed out and poured tea over everything, trying to refill his cup, and I went away to feed the calves. He wobbled out after a while and showed me all the calves that had weak constitutions. He said I might just as well knock them on the head because any fool could see that they'd never see the winter through. I'd been feeding them for about 2 months, so I decided to keep on and take a sporting chance about it. Uncle John brightened up a little after dinner and said he would help Gus and me ring the bull. We went over to Gus's place and found Gus looking rather yellow. Uncle gave him a lecture about it. Uncle wanted to know why he didn't use his common sense. If he suffered from biliousness, why didn't he go to the seat of trouble and doctor himself up? By the looks of him, Uncle reckoned it was diseased liver he had, and he would have to be very, very careful of himself. He should go down to Harawira and see some quack down there, Uncle knew, and if anything could be done, that would be the man to do it. Gus led the way inside, and here Uncle had some more to say. When he was a young man, he batched in a tin shanty for years, and people used to come from far and near in order to see how clean and neat he kept his things. He said Gus's house was a filthy, revolting sight not fit for pigs, let alone human beings. How a strong, husky young man like Gus could be content to wallow in such loathsome circumstances had Uncle beat properly. Look at the floor! Good heavens, man! Don't you ever scrape it? Gus got a bit huffy the way Uncle John kept harping on and snapped. No, I don't scrape it, I sweep it. Gus said it was all very fine for some people to come nosing about where they weren't wanted and pull things to pieces, but when a man was running a dairy farm single-handed, he had other work to do. If Gus started messing about the house, getting finicky over things, who was going to do the work? Uncle roared again at that. Uncle said nobody expected him to live in the place all the time, but why didn't he clean the show up, say once a week? He asked Gus for the broom and said he would give him an idea of what he meant. Gus had to hunt about a bit before he found it, and finally I remembered we'd used that out in his shed a fortnight ago to sweep up a bag of slag that had burst when Gus was preparing to drill in his spring oats. When Gus got back with the broom, Uncle John started to sweep up. He dived in the corners that hadn't been swept for 4 years, and the rubbish he collected was a caution. Gus put in an anxious time hopping to and fro over the broom, rescuing studs and lost pipes and little things he'd lost the run of for years. I enjoyed the show myself. It was a change to see Gus getting bellowed out so neatly, because he always puts on such side when he comes over to see me. To hear Gus criticising my housekeeping, a stranger would fancy he'd come straight out of a palace, and I was pleased to see him taken down a peg. Uncle took the cream off the joke, however. He leaned over his broom for a while to let the dust settle, and said that only once in all his experience had he ever seen anything approaching it. I wanted to keep the old chap on the subject. It isn't often I get such a good one on to old Gus, so I said in an eager voice, "And when was that, Uncle John?" Uncle John looked at me up and down in a calm, impartial manner and replied, "Over at that stinking hovel of yours, my lad." After that, Gus and I left the old chap to it and went out to muster the bull. Gus wondered if old Uncle had always been so insulting. He said it was a funny thing to him he had reached such a green old age. We finally decided it was rot to take any notice of him. He was in his second childhood, and men like us should humour the old chap and pretend we really liked listening to him. Gus said he expected I would be the same long before I reached Uncle John's age, because he noticed a tendency to nag about me even now. Evidently it ran in my family. We drafted Gus's pedigree bull out onto the road and ran him over to my yard with a couple of yearlings for company. Gus had the ring and I supplied a coil of rope and a steel to drill the hole with. Uncle John turned up before we had anything fixed and proceeded to take the situation in hand. As the bull was nervous, not wild, just nervous, Uncle showed us how to tell a wild bull from a nervous one. We decided to throw him down and tie his legs. The one thing every man had to be careful about in ringing a bull was to be sure not to lose the small screw that fastened the ring together after it was through the nose. Gus trusted me with it. He said he would fix the ring in place, and when he held his hand out, I was to put the screw into his fingers. Then there would be no mistakes. One thing we all hated, especially Uncle John, was a mess up over a job like that. The reason Uncle John reckoned the bull was nervous was because he ran round and round the yard, trying all the spaces between the rails. If he were out and out wild, it would be a different tale. We wouldn't be in the yard with him, Uncle John could tell us that. We weren't in that yard with him very much longer as it happened, because when Gus coiled up the rope and made to move to lasso him, things began to happen. Uncle John bit his clay pipe through while he was climbing the rails, and the way he went off about it, it was a fair scorcher. Gus said he would buy him a gross of things if he would only shut up, but that was no good. That clay pipe was the only one Uncle had ever managed to colour properly in the 50 years' experience with clay pipes. He wouldn't have taken £10 for it, and there it was, smashed, all because Gus didn't have the brains to know a wild bull when he saw one. Next time Uncle came to help us, he was going to have things done his way, or else he would go inside out of it and let us get killed our own way. He didn't care which. When Gus left the yard, he'd forgotten to take the rope with him, and we had a bit of an argument as to who would get down off the rails and get it. I would have done it myself, as I only pointed out to Gus he was careless enough to leave it there, so it was up to him to go back for it. We finally compromised by raking it through the rails with the aid of a garden rake lashed to the end of a long pole. One of the little things I've been intending to do for the last year or so is to build a strong race in my yard so that I can run wild cattle into it and shut them in. We put in over an hour trying to snare that bull from the rails, and finally Uncle John got impatient and took the rope away from us. He coiled it up into 2 neat coils and held it in one hand, 2 fingers separating the coils. That was the proper way to hold a lariat. As soon as the bull turned his head towards Uncle, he shouted, "Now, watch closely, boys," and he threw the whole thing at the bull. It landed on his horns, and if Uncle had only hung on to one end instead of letting the whole lot go, he would have saved us a lot of worry. After the bull had shaken it off and made a careful examination of it, it was Uncle's turn to get the rope, but the old chap jibbed on it. He said he wouldn't have minded going down into the yard with that bull if Gus and I had only done what he'd wanted us to do at first. Now the bull was excited after the way we had been messing around with him, and Uncle said our stupid folly was the cause of it, and we could finish the job ourselves. We raked the rope out again, and before we tried any more lasso work, we tied one end to the top rail of the yard, and then I had a go. I used to be pretty good at that sort of thing once. I remember lassoing our big rooster at home once when I was a boy. He was just in the deep notes of a very impressive crow when I got him around the neck. Everybody that spotted him for the next week or so thought some dog had worried him. I must have lost my throw since then, because I didn't make much of a show at snaring the bull. Gus did the trick in the end, and he started to tell Uncle John and I why it was we had been so long over it. If only we'd let him do it instead of insisting on having a go ourselves, the bull would have been rung hours ago. If we wanted to practice that sort of thing, why didn't we practice on some post in the evenings instead of wasting valuable time when he wanted to get his pedigree bull rung? The next job was to throw the bull and get him tied up securely. That didn't take very long because we hauled him up to a post and then got down into the yard and surrounded him. Uncle John got kicked in the watch pocket while he was stooping down explaining to Gus how to make a slip knot and lay it on the ground for the bull to step into. I thought the old chap was done that time. I remembered wondering who would be responsible for the funeral expenses while I was nipping to the house for a billy of water. The old boy was only winded, luckily, and after I heaved the water over him, he soon let us know he wasn't dead. While he went away to pack his swag up, Gus and I threw the bull and ringed him. I remembered the little screw and put it in my mouth for safety. I was leaning over Gus to see he did things right when the bull made a desperate struggle for liberty, and Gus's head came up and caught me in the face. I spat blood and cried and blew my nose for about half a minute, and then Gus got wild because I couldn't find that little screw. It was getting near milking time, and we fixed things in the end by reeving a fine piece of wire through the bull ring and twisted the ends. Gus said of all the born fools, I was one of them. Next time he had a little job to do, I was to keep away. I only got in his road and worried him. I don't see there was any need for that myself. If he'd kept his head still, instead of jerking it about the way he did, I wouldn't have swallowed the screw. I told him the best thing he could do was to lose his fool of a bull and lead it away out of my yard. I didn't want it on my place. Gus calmed down and talked more reasonably after that. He said it was only an accident and I shouldn't get so touchy over it. Nobody could help that sort of thing happening. It was just fate, and he expected it would be better to leave the bull tied up in the yard for a day before we shifted him. He thought if I gave him some hay and a drink of water, he would be quite alright and we could get him home next day when he was calmed down a bit more. Then we went inside to see what time it was and had to inspect Uncle John's gold watch. Uncle had it all spread out on a newspaper, and how a bull could kick a watch to pieces like that in one kick beat me. It was a family heirloom, that watch. No money could have bought it, and Uncle John gave us its whole history. He said he had intended leaving it to me, together with a few of his other small belongings, but now I could welter in poverty where I was. Every time I woke up in the future and remembered that I didn't have that watch, I could just meditate on the way I had smashed it up on him. He said once he used to feel sorry for me, dragging out a poverty-stricken existence on such a sour, barren farm. He had intended seeing what he could do about it. Some of his Harawira land could be on his hands again shortly, but now he was going to wash his hands of me. He was finished with me. He came up to give me a helping hand knowing I would be busy, and I deliberately set out to show him he wasn't wanted. Gus dodged away to get his cows in, and I went for mine, and when I got inside again that night, Uncle John had gone, bag and baggage. Next morning, Gus came over to take his bull home and tried to tell me it was all my fault. I knew what Uncle John was like, and Gus said I should have taken precautions to see that poor old chap didn't get hurt. The bull was still too wild to lead, and Gus seemed to fancy that it was all my fault as well. He said it seemed queer to him, the way the bull had played up if anyone went near him, almost as if he'd been knocked about. I didn't like the suspicious way Gus looked at me when he said that. I asked him if he thought I'd spent the night prodding the bull with a stick, and Gus said, only he shouldn't be as wild as that. Gus had seen hundreds of bulls ringed and tied up for a night, and they had all tamed down by morning. We tied a post on the end of the chain in the finish, and let the bull out, and he dragged the post over to Gus's place by the nose. He made pretty good time too, and if he hadn't got the post jammed across Gus's calf paddock gate when he bolted through there, I doubt if we could have caught him again. Gus tied him up to the fence and then expressed himself as satisfied. "Mark," he said, "it's a good job it was me who bought this bull. You would have never handled him if you'd got him. Not a word of credit for me or Uncle John. A man ought to cut out trying to help Gus Tomlins."